Welcome to the Test Guild Automation Podcast, where we all get together to learn more about automation and software testing, with your host, Joe Colantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. And today we have Paul Grizzaffi back with us to talk all about Let's Talk About Failure. Paul is a principal automation architect at Cognizant Softvision, which I didn't know. I thought he worked at another company, and we might dive into that. Paul also is following his passion for providing technology solutions for testing QE and QA organizations, including automation assessments, implementations, and activities benefiting the broader testing community. He's an accomplished keynote speaker. You've probably heard him speak at a bunch of different conferences, so he really knows his stuff. I think he's spoken at Software Test Professionals, STPCon, STQA, UT Dallas. He spoke at Automation Guild a bunch of times. So he's a frequent lecturer, does a lot of different conferences and meetings. In addition to spending his time, he has two twins. He's a metalhead, which I always love. And he obviously enjoys sharing his experience and learning with other testing professionals. And you can definitely check out all his stuff at his blog at Responsible Automation, which we'll have in the show notes down below. So you don't want to miss this episode. Check it out. The Test Guild Automation Podcast is sponsored by the fantastic folks at Sauce Labs. Their cloud-based test platform helps ensure your favorite mobile apps and websites work flawlessly on every browser, operating system, and device. Get a free trial. Visit testguild.com/Sauce Labs and click on the exclusive sponsor section to try it for free for 14 days. Check it out. Hey, Paul, welcome back to the Guild.
Thank you, sir. Been a while.
Yeah, it's been a long time. When did you change jobs? I thought you worked at a different company, and I looked down in my notes, and your bio was different. Was that during COVID, or have you been there a while, and I just missed it?
Well, in February of this year, Cognizant Softvision acquired Magenic. And I was at Magenic before, so we were acquired earlier this year, and the Magenic brand has slowly been absorbed into the Softvision brand. So now I'm at Softvision.
Nice. How did that work transitioning during COVID?
I don't know that it was that much different, other than everything was being done virtually, whereas perhaps some of the stuff would have been more in person. But I didn't live next to one of the Magenic offices anyway, so I've been working at home full time for the last 5 years.
Oh, nice, cool.
So for me, it wasn't an in person versus not. It's just what I'm used to now.
Gotcha. Cool. Paul, also, is there anything I missed in your bio before we get into the topic today?
No, I think you overinflated my ego just enough. Thank
you. Cool. So you actually wrote a really good blog post on, I think it was kind of like based on gaming, or like a bad spin example of ignoring automation ecosystems that I thought we'd dive into a little bit today.
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right. So the first one, bad spin, that you went over is...
Okay, give the wheel a spin.
So it's strategy, I believe. So can you give it a little example of why maybe strategy in an automation ecosystem, how that plays into your experience?
Sure. So for the automation ecosystem, as you alluded to, there are really three components. There's the strategy, there's the audience, and then there's the environment. And I once worked with an organization where none of these things were considered, or they weren't considered judiciously enough prior to my joining, and certain decisions had been made about tooling and approaches and stuff. And they didn't really have the notion of an automation ecosystem to ask the good questions. So from a strategy standpoint, there wasn't really a strategy for automation or even testing that aligned with their corporate goals. It was, okay, we're going to do great. We're agile now. We're Scrum. Yay. And therefore we have to automate. And then since we're automating, we're going to do ATDD. Let's get a trainer in here. You're trained. Now you're agile. Now you're ATDD. Go. And then they hired me. So there was no real thought around How is this going to align with the business goals? Which business goals, either technology based or financial based, is this going to help us accomplish? And they didn't have a conversation, at least with me, where they explained that and said, here's what we're trying to do in the bigger picture. It was go and sit and do. And I wasn't quite as involved in my thinking around an ecosystem to be able to have the conversations back to them at that time. This is more of a concept that I came into a little later in my career.
Gotcha. So how often does that, I know you do a lot of consulting. How often is this something you see a lot of times at different companies?
Yes, I do see we automate because we do the DevOps or we do the Agile or we do the this thing or that thing, process-driven automation or framework-driven automation. And that's not intrinsically bad, because to meet some of the goals of those particular frameworks or processes, automation isn't written down that you must do it, but to do it in a rapid manner or in a reproducible manner, automation is either essential or it's highly recommended. But the what you automate, how you automate, the order you do things in, certainly your business strategy should be coloring that. Because I just gave an internal talk a few minutes ago, and one of the things I said is if we're not automating in direct support of testing, and testing isn't direct support of the business goals, we're probably automating the wrong thing. What
do people do when you say that? Do they look at you funny? Is that something you have to actually explain often?
It depends. It depends if the organization believes that they are getting appropriate value out. They might look at me funny. Sometimes we get brought into organizations because they weren't as successful as they wanted to be with automation and testing, and we do an evaluation or we try to do a rehabilitation, and then these conversations are a little better thought of. And also it kind of depends on the audience. The more technical the audience is, the less they grok that immediately. And this is a broad paintbrush. This is not every person in every organization, of course. But when you talk to business leaders and say, look, we need to be aligned this way and aligned with this and in support of that, everybody kind of goes, yeah, okay, cool. And then when you ask, okay, so this automation that you're doing, the specific activity you're doing here, which business goal is that going to help you attain? Or which is it in support of? That's where you get a head scratch sometimes, because they haven't thought about how to connect those two together. And it's not that they don't know the answer. Usually they know the answer, but no one's asked the question, and they have to sit back and think about it for a bit, a minute, an hour, a day, or whatever, to come up with a cogent response.
So I assume they just say automate everything, and then you have to explain, well, what are the risk areas, where you make the money area? Like, where areas do you recommend they look at when they don't have a proper strategy in place to know what they're automating or why they're even automating?
I do look at what are your big business goals, or at least what are sometimes the biggest corporate business goals get boiled down into individual organizational goals that mean a lot more to individuals in the organization, or at least are more tangible to those individuals. So approaching it at the organization level is helpful, or even at the team level if we're really having trouble getting started. That's a good way to go about having that particular conversation. And again, what I'm talking about a lot of times is a business goal is we want to be 30% faster to market, or we need to get this out by date X so we beat our competitor, our number one competitor or whatever. Okay, those color differently what you might start with. One, you want to focus perhaps on speed. One, perhaps you want to focus on a bigger quality initiative where you do want to get to market faster, but you're not looking to beat a hard deadline at that point.
So,
but when it comes to the automate every, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Automate everything. Yeah.
When it comes to automate everything, I do get that a lot. Yes, we want to automate everything. Then we start talking about, well, what does everything mean? And usually people and organizations, once you start having that particular conversation and say, well, are you willing to staff this way? Are you willing to pay this amount of money? Are you willing to not release something because it's missing one of the automation tests? And when you start quantifying it in the more micro way of the nuts and bolts, a lot of teams will step back from and go, okay, 100% probably isn't the right approach. What is the right approach?
Absolutely. So when you're trying to explain a strategy, do you ever do like an implementation, like 2 weeks to say, this is what it looks like? Let's try it through the whole software development lifecycle that you have to see how it's going to work and how everyone's going to interact with it?
Well, what I like to do is I like to look at all three parts of the ecosystem at the same time. And from that, make a determination on how should we approach automation. And yes, we should do a prototype, proof of concept, a pilot. And the difference between what we've been calling pilot versus proof of concept is something we're going to throw away at the end. A pilot is we're going to do something small that if everybody likes it, we keep it. So it's less quick and dirty. It is more a formal approach, but it's not a guarantee that we're going to go this way, but we would have something sustainable when we're done with it.
So I also think it's tough because sometimes you get too deep in the weeds or you don't get in the weeds enough. So like, do you usually start with the end in mind? Like, what is their end goal at the end? And then from there, that's where you build up the strategy?
Yes. You got to know where you're going, right? So yes, we want to have a smoke suite that can run every deploy, or we want to have a portion of our existing regression tests automated because of reasons, whatever the reasons are. We want to go in and we want to have that done. Well, you can't twinkle your nose and just magically have it done. You have to start somewhere. A lot of times we start with what's going to make you feel good about the direction that we've picked. What's going to make you feel more confident that whatever we're doing here is the right direction? Let's put that in place. And one of the things I usually like to do is when we do a proof of concept, even if it's with a tool I haven't used before, run it against a little toy site or whatever, but very quickly automate against something interesting in your application. Something that's basic bread and butter that people will understand and go, oh, yeah, okay, I see that working. But also, you as the expert in your application, you know where the bodies are buried. You know where the icky parts are that are going to be difficult to automate because we're using this homegrown framework in the app, or we got this third-party thing that's not supported anymore, or this component's 15 years old, so it's hard to automate. Let's make sure we get some of that in the proof of concept as well. I mean, you don't want to do all of that because you'll wind up with one script instead of like maybe 4 or 5 where you can see some better examples. But you definitely want to hit some of the more interesting spots in your application. Otherwise, you're not really going to know, is this automation tool that you picked and this approach you're going to take, is it something that's digestible and tolerable and valuable for you?
Nice. So you did mention you went to an organization, they were doing ATDD. A lot of companies maybe just say, we're going to do BDD. That's our strategy. When you go to an organization like that already are like have they think they have a strategy in place. Maybe they've already trained up their folks on it. But there's definitely a disconnect you're seeing after you've spoken with them between what they've chosen and whether or not it's going to work. How do you deliver that to them to let them know, look, this is probably not the optimal way. I know you've already invested time and resources in it, but let's change ship before we go all the way in.
Very, very delicately.
Yeah.
And usually I get some of our business partners to help with that conversation. I'll explain to sort of like the engagement managers and the delivery managers, say, look, this particular approach that they have here, I understand what they think they're doing, but that's not really what they're going to get out of this. And here's all the risks and gotchas. How accepting is this client going to be for that? Which vocabulary can we use? Which can we not use? Which executives have been made promises to? Because sometimes if the promises have been made all we can do is help them be successful in their goals, refining some of the things along the way, some of the finer points, and say, hey, yes, this is still what you were talking about, but if we approach it from this direction, you'll have less maintenance, or you'll have better sustainability, or it won't cost it, or whatever, so that they still get to achieve what they wanted to achieve based on expectations and promises, but perhaps what we create with them will be a bit more healthy.
All right. So if we're going to do something bad, let's do something bad good almost.
Something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Because
how often?
Really, as a consultant, my job is to ask questions and make suggestions.
Yep.
But it's also to help that client be successful. And if I could help them be more successful, I'm going to try that. But if I can only help them be a certain amount successful based on the environment, to go back to the ecosystem and the audience that there, I have to work within those confines, because sometimes those are immovable objects.
Absolutely. All right. So you did mention the next spin of the wheel of bad spins usually in organizations, and that is.
Okay, give the wheel a spin.
I like this.
Just for you, I did this gag.
Awesome.
All right. Next one is audience. So, what does audience fit into like a bad spin you see at most organizations maybe doing with their automation environments or automation ecosystems?
A lot of times it's not understanding two things: what your audience is prepared to tolerate and who's actually in your audience. Because the direct audience is those are the people that are typing the keys for the automation. So the testers, the developers, whoever's creating the automation, maintaining the automation, running it, and then acting on the results. Those are your direct audience. Do they have the right skill set? Do they need to be trained up? Do you need to supplement? You can absolutely build an automation endeavor on your own with no external expertise, as long as you're sufficiently tolerant in the rework and the failure and the good failure that's going to happen along the way. Most businesses are not that tolerant. They're not tolerant for that timetable, that perceived wasted effort. If you're not tolerant, then you better have some money, because you're going to have to either bring in an expert, hire them in, or rent them, like coming to somebody like SoftVision and say, look, we need some help with this, jumpstart us, train us, and then we can evolve to that. Valid approaches. You just have to know what your cash flow situation is and what your tolerance is. So that's your direct audience. But then there's the indirect audience. Those are the people who are automation interested, perhaps leadership. What kind of reports need to be generated for them? And why should they care? You shouldn't really care after a certain level of promotion. You shouldn't really care if it's humans or automation or elves doing the work, right? As long as you're getting the value out of the money you're putting in and you're meeting those business goals, right? The strategy to meet the business goals, as long as it's there, it shouldn't matter by and large who and what is doing the work, but we're not there from a digesting standpoint. And also up front, we may need some short lifespan metrics to make people feel good. Yes, this is our progress on our pass fail, and this is our progress on number of things automated. Eventually, those metrics go stale, and we need to stop keeping track of them because they're not interesting in the big picture. But to show growth up front, sometimes they're kind of necessary. But who else is in the extended audience? People that are affected by the automation. Let's say your IT, your desktop support. Where are you going to run your automation? Can you run it on your desktop? Does it need to run in a segregated lab? Well, perhaps they need to set that up for you. There has to be money for that, right? So these are people in the audience. Hey, I want to set up a mail server on the corporate network so that I can do this testing of this mail feature. Corporate security is not going to go for that. So you need to partner with them as part of the extended audience and say, I have these needs, these business needs to align with the business strategy we're all supposed to be getting toward, right? See, I'm taking everything back to the strategy. Help me be successful here under your rules and guidance. And I've had some success doing that, going to external organizations like security and IT and different things and said, look, we have this goal. I understand I can't do this thing I want to do. Here's what I need to be able to do. Please help me with this. And then sometimes they go, okay, you get an exception. Sometimes they say, oh, I understand. We can configure this other thing for you. And it's helpful at that point. And then the one I didn't think about until my previous job is the legal team. Why would you care about the legal team? Well, legal's a big deal with respect to licensing and usage. Well, one of the companies I worked with, all of a sudden we had to get every piece of software's license reviewed for appropriateness, because we were seeing in the news companies getting sued over using this and using that. None of this was open source, but it was third-party licensed stuff. And we didn't want to be one of those people in the news. So legal got involved. And I worked with them to say, look, none of our software goes into any of our products. It all stays internal. All this open source stuff is not baked into an app. So they went, okay, then we can fast track all of your things, because as long as it's a license we've seen and you continue to explain to us not going in a product, we can do this in hours instead of days. I'm like, okay, cool. Sounds good. So having that partnership, because they are part of the audience, indirect audience, but they're there, having that partnership gives you a lot more flexibility in what you can and can't do. Subsequently, it gives you a lot more choice in what types of tools you use and are able to use to get your job done.
How forward-thinking do you need to be when you're considering the audience? Let's say it's a greenfield application, and a lot of times I don't know if people look at the roadmap like, okay, right now we could probably get away with this, but like a year from now we're going to implement this other feature. So, like, do you over-engineer at the beginning to anticipate what's going to be part of the roadmap going forward and thinking of your audience at that point, or do you focus just on the now or the next few months or something?
That's case by case. So if we already know that there's a roadmap laid out and the roadmap is committed or has a high level of certainty to it, I would probably engineer for the future, but not so much that it's going to impact delivery along the way. So let's say I could spend 8 hours a day doing all the tactical, the now, and forget about the future. Well, eventually the future is going to come back and bite me, and there's going to be some rework and stuff that has to happen there. Or I could do all of the supporting infrastructure up front, but that's going to be days or weeks of not producing anything for the now. So a blended approach is usually better, simply because that's more tolerable to the money people, to the people. They want stuff now, but they don't want to have the rework later. So if you can do a blend where, I forget who told me this, but basically plan big and implement local, right? Implement small. So get the big plan. Don't do anything that's going to preclude you from doing your evolution in the future, knowing that there might be a 10 to 20% rework, but it's less than a 50 to 80% rework. So plan for the future, deliver for the now or the soon, and be prepared to evolve, and make that all very apparent to the organization you're working for or working with.
So I would think when you're trying to figure out the audience and getting everyone in agreement, stakeholders, any tips on how to do that? Like, do you always recommend you go to legal first, say this is what we plan on doing? And do you have any input, or we have end users that might want to use something? How do you get a consensus then that this is the right audience?
So a lot of times that is baked into the client's process already. Okay. Hey, we want to bring in this particular open source. Y'all cool with open source here? No open source here. Really? You don't use this or this or this? No, I guess we do. Let me go talk to somebody. And then we basically deputize them to go and talk to people for us and find out what's the situation. Because they know their culture far better than we do, right? We're there for a while. In some cases, we might be there years. In some cases, we might be there a couple of months, just depending on the scope of what it is they want from us. But they're always going to know their culture better than we do, because they live it, eat it, breathe it It's them. It's what they do. They'll know who to talk to. They'll know what the tolerance is. They'll know what they've done before and what they got slapped down for and what they were okay with. So I typically rely on that. But in cases where no one's thought of that, I ask them to make the decision. Should you go to legal about this? Should you go and talk to so-and-so about this? Here's what I've done with other clients and other companies. Does that fit with you? And then they think about it and they make their own context-sensitive decision.
Nice. So, Paul, that brings us to the last spin of the bad spin wheel here.
Okay,
automation.
give the wheel a spin.
Oh, it landed on environment. So how does environment fit into your big picture here with an automation ecosystem?
So environment, that's all the sort of the tangible stuff, right? The computers, the networks. What are you testing? Where are you going to test it? How are you going to do the testing, the nuts and bolts, to plug this in, to plug that in? How is all that going to be done? Because depending on how constrained you are or how liberal you're able to be, that is going to change the number of tool candidates and approach candidates that you have, either by increasing it or decreasing it, because you're getting more and more close to, okay, what is it that I'm actually trying to get done here with the tangible bits? So this is the thing we tend to get right, but incomplete. So we know what we're testing. We know by and large what our environments are. But there are some things that perhaps we don't think about. For instance, I worked on a tool that was licensed, or worked with a tool that was licensed, and it was run off a license server. And that was cool, no problem. Just run off the license server. As long as the license server is up and running, we're good to go. And then I was on an airplane, and I didn't have any internet. So I couldn't run the tool. So I couldn't do any work locally until I got off the plane. Like, oh, hadn't thought about that. And then that took me another step where back when I worked at the telecom company, most of our test traffic went on what we called a red LAN. So basically a lab LAN. All that traffic did not go to the actual testing traffic didn't go to the desktop, or none of the high bandwidth testing traffic went on the corporate network. So if we had a license serve tool there, where would that license server live? Could it live on the corporate network because that's where we were running the UI? Okay, does the backend need to talk to it? What if it needed to talk? Maybe we didn't run the license server. Maybe it needed to call out to the mothership to find out the license server. Then perhaps we couldn't get the network traffic off of the red LAN out to the real world, right? So then at that point, what would we do? Well, we couldn't go with floating licenses, right? We would have to go with node lock licenses. That changes your economic profile because node lock licenses tend to be cheaper per license. However, you need a lot more. You need one per user ID or one per node if they're node locked. Then you'd have to redo the math and say, does this particular tool still fit in my budget profile? Or has the licensing nature of it discounted it for my particular team because of my particular environment setup?
So I'm just thinking of enterprise companies when you think about environment. I'm thinking about dependencies on either third-party services or third-party products within the company, but that they do the testing, and the piece you're testing is just going to have an interface with it. It's just going to communicate with it.
Yes.
Did you have people think about third-party dependencies and how they're going to handle it? Maybe service virtualization, or like, what are your thoughts on that?
So service virtualization is this really good concept that most people don't want to pay for. They would much rather, oh, no, I'm just going to use the live product. So they're going to get the version from the dependent team, and then they're going to run it themselves. And then they're going to have to share that with 3 other teams. And if one team changes the data, then it changes for us. And now we have to go negotiate. You know exactly what I'm talking about because you're nodding there. And I see that a lot. And for whatever reason, the cost of that is either actually less than going with service virtualization, or it appears to be less because it trickles in as opposed to being a big thump of cash down. So I've not worked with any clients that have really wanted to go with service virtualization. I've also been fortunate enough that third parties like PayPal, they have a way to do some testing, right? But you still have to hit their network to do it. You still get it's like an extra step. I don't remember what the actual coding magic was, but still you have to hit external network. And the way we are so distributed and dependent on third-party services, it's hard to do testing completely in a segregated box unless you've got everything in the box or you've got it mocked, stubbed, tolerant of not, like, let's say analytics. Well, I couldn't send out my analytics or request my analytics or whatever. Nothing fails because of that. If you got it, the system sufficiently tolerant of that for testing, of course. But then are you really testing the product? You're testing some aspect of it. So, I mean, if you run a test now and then you run the same test again, did you really just run the same test twice? Some might say no, because something's changed. If nothing else, the time has changed. Does that matter to any of the algorithms along the way? It does or it doesn't, right? So did you run the same test? The answer is really no. But did you run a sufficiently same test? Yes, you did. So you start talking about risk and different types of, did I cover the important things, the high risk things? When we talk about strategy, everybody's silent strategy is don't be on the front page of the paper. For those of you that still know what a newspaper is, you know, nobody wants to be above the fold. Nobody wants to be that first on CNN or MSNBC or whatever channel you watch to say company had huge outage or company had huge data breach. Nobody wants that.
So, talking about data breaches and stories like that, I know in LinkedIn, you mentioned you were going to be on the show, and Jim Hazen said, you're going to tell me any war stories. So, that you've all talked about during the year. So during any of these three pieces, strategy, audience, or environment, there's any stories of companies that may have gotten one piece wrong or may not have known about or really focused in on the right thing in any of these pillars, I guess, of an automation ecosystem?
Well, that's the core of the blog post, is an example of one organization I worked with where they didn't do any of the three correctly.
Right.
And I would say one of them, they didn't do it all. I don't think they looked at their audience at all. I think it was, we are agile, we're doing ATDD, go forth and be that way. Here's your training, here's your other training, now we're Scrum, start. And I wasn't there for that part, but that was the way it was explained to me, and I'm sort of being cavalier about the delivery back. But really, they didn't look at their business strategy. They just looked and said, we're process, we're automation because process, automation because Scrum. And then from their audience, the audience wasn't the right audience for what they were trying to do. And the audience had concerns, many of them legitimate, about doing all of these things instead of focusing on some of the other aspects. And I don't think either leadership didn't listen to that or didn't hear that, or didn't sufficiently allay those and say, look, we understand all of that, but here's what our big picture looks like. I don't think they had those conversations. And again, a lot of that happened before I got there, so I can't really say whether it did or not. This is what it appears like showing up on day one going, oh, wow, what did I get myself into? And then for the environment, again, most of the time we get the environment right, but we had very inconsistent access to the pre-production environments. We had to ask for this and wait on that, and oh, wait, so-and-so's using that already. Some of the things we could do on our desktop, and then others we just had to work on the shared system because, again, a very large distributed high-end system, it's very difficult to have a bunch of those, especially with older technology, and this technology from the early 90s probably. So yeah, there are all sorts of different things there. So what did we wind up with? We wound up with a tiny little bit of Automation Assist, and I'm really proud of that particular piece of Automation Assist. But no real progress with ATDD, no real progress with most of the teams really adopting any sort of test first approach. And I wasn't as well read back then as I am now. I didn't realize that ATDD wasn't really about testing. It's really about your design and can it do what it's supposed to do? Not does it do? Not is it in lieu of these other tests? So we did have a separate testing organization that was going to do some additional like regression and testing and those types of things. But it didn't understand the dichotomy at the time, and it wasn't explained well either by the teacher or by the leadership to say, no, these are helping us with the development part. The other testing part's going to happen separately.
So I was in the same situation. I was working for an organization. The company said, thou shalt do BDD. And they got everyone trained up, and developers, even during training, it's like, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing BDD, TDD. And it turned into a nightmare. Like 4 years into it, like it was just a disaster. So do you see most companies being more successful when it comes from the top down or the down up of people driving these initiatives? Like if the developers were clamoring for, yeah, we should do BDD, then maybe that's the right thing to do? Or does it, I guess it all depends on this situation.
It all depends on the culture and the nature of just what the organizations are. Who is really seeing what the core problem is? Is the core problem technology and process? Then perhaps the team has a better view on what can help them be more effective or more efficient. Is it more cultural, business related, and delivery related? And like commitment related? Perhaps the business has, or the leadership at that point would have a better idea of what needs to change. But the thing that's missed most often in these, quote, test first approaches is the fact that, number one, it's not testing, but number two, it is a cultural change. And you have to have a high bandwidth communication between the so-called three amigos, right? So the product ownership, we're paying lip service to the TDD or the ATDD Scrum thing, but managing it like a project office, right? Yep. Fine, but then let's not say we're doing it. Let's say we're doing it the old way, and we can all get on with our lives, right? Yep.
Straight up, so spot on. Culture is so critical when you're dealing with anything with automation, development, anything. So, great advice. Okay, Paul, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give to someone to help them with their automation ecosystem strategy? And what's the best way to find or contact you?
So the one piece of advice I always give, it's be valuable. If you're doing something with technology to help you do your job and it is providing more value than it is cost, keep doing that. But if you see that it is costing you more to build it and or maintain it than it is providing value for it, don't do that. Go do something else. Focus on value. That is the main piece of actionable advice I can give anybody, because they can start doing it right this minute. They can look at the next thing they're going to do and say, is this going to provide value? And if it is, do it. And if not, perhaps question, should I be doing it? Or could I do it differently where it does provide value? And then if you want to contact me, the best way is you can hit me up on LinkedIn. You can hit me up on Twitter at @Grizzaffi. I've also got as you alluded to, my blog at responsibleautomation.wordpress.com. And then I've got some speaking things lined up here pretty quickly. I'll be speaking at the Soft Vision Programmers Week next week. I've got a little blip on TestFlix. And then next year I'll be keynoting 2 conferences, one not announced yet, and one is in Flectricon.
Thanks again for your automation awesomeness. The links to everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com/A367. And while you're there, make sure to click on the Try for Free Today link under the exclusive sponsor section to learn all about Sauce Labs' awesome products and services. And if the show has helped you in any way, why not rate it and review it in iTunes? Reviews really help in the rankings of the show, and I read each and every one of them. So that's it for this episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating end-to-end, full-stack automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Head on over to testguild.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and online testing conferences. Don't forget to subscribe to the Guild to continue your testing journey.